What's up, everyone? Tyler Tamboline here, aka Toe Tag and Tambo, back for another edition. I'm back in the saddle, another edition of the PrizePicks DraftKings show. Got my main man JT Hayes. He don't miss a show. I missed last week. I apologize for that, but was glad to see my guy Bobby Gomes fill in. Had some really good takes on there. The show was great, but I'm back. It's week 4, JT. We've got some more information. How you doing, my man?
I'm doing great. Welcome back. It's nice. It's nice to have you back. But I'll say this, Bobby Gomes last week filled in, and when he was talking about it on Sunday, something that really surprised me, and I kind of went with it because I was like, all right, yeah, I could see how that could work. But God, if he wasn't spot on with the Giovanni Bernard call with the Bucs missing Antonio Brown, of course, Bernard getting in there late for a touchdown. He helped one of our members make a ton of money on the late slate with the call. And so kudos to Bobby Gomes. Did a good job filling in, and happy to have you back, though. It's week 4. We've got, as we were talking about just before we went on, a lot more data now. We've got some interesting matchups and interesting divisional matchups. And then we're seeing teams separate themselves, not necessarily in a good way, but teams that we're going to be looking to pick on for the remainder of the season. So really, really interesting week this week.
Yeah, I think you said it best, and we did chat a little pre-show, but just the idea of now we have more information. Everyone always says this in daily fantasy. It applies to PrizePicks too, which we'll get to in a second. But when you get the more information, the other thing is that some people forget, and why this week for me still feels a little bit uncomfortable when we get to DraftKings later on, because while there's more information for us, there's more information for the sites, DraftKings in particular, and that means they've got the price adjustments in there as well. So even when you feel good about a play, the cost that's associated with it might not feel so good when cost hits the wallet and you got to put them into your lineup with your salary restrictions. So we'll get to that when we get into that. But before we do, JT, talk about PrizePicks for a minute. I'll talk quickly here about the procedure for the show. If you haven't viewed before, we're going to go in. We're each going to give our top 2 PrizePicks of the week. There is a contest going on that you can talk. We'll talk about here in a second. But I think it's a great thing, and it's a great site. I've been making decent money on the site every week, JT, with these picks that we've got, and just going back and forth and playing with it, even when we get off the show, and try and piece some of the things we talk to together. And a lot of people don't know that, right? With props in general, there's just a lot of money to be made. And for what most people are putting down on them, there's lots of opportunity. You're not going to get cut off like some of the myths out there and things like that with prop betting. You're not putting $100,000 on the prop. So you're going to be okay. You can make a lot of money on these things and looking through these lines. So talk to us a little bit about PrizePicks, JT.
Yeah, PrizePicks, it's great because I did, as some people watching might know, I did the Mayo shows for PrizePicks during the Major League Baseball season. And football, same thing. DraftKings, fantasy scoring points. And out of the goodness of Pat Mayo's heart, they've got a special contest, and you pick 5 PrizePicks every single week. It's just the over or under of DraftKings points. Your total wager has to equal $7.11. That's how PrizePicks will know to trigger it into this contest. And then there's some great prizes. First prize at the end of the season wins $3,000. Second prize, $1,500 in site credits for PrizePicks. And then there's $50 bonuses every week if you get 5 picks right. But also, they have a very generous heart. And if you're absolutely the worst person at this, if this is something that maybe you should definitely stop doing after the football season and you come in dead last, they're going to give you a bonus as well. So it's a pretty great contest. And like you mentioned, some of these lines come out and you can, some of them almost jump off the page because you look at them and you say, okay, wait a second, this is such a great matchup. And some of them are traps, of course, but there's a bunch of us on these videos all week long helping you through that, and had a decent week myself last week. Kenny Golladay got there. I started, obviously we record this on Thursday nights, started looking at some news on Friday that they were going to limit his snaps, that he may still be a little bit injured, and probably more so due to the injuries to Sterling Shepard and Darius Slayton. He did get the over there. Daniel Jones did not get there, did not throw more than 1.5 passing touchdowns against the Falcons defense. That was a disgusting game, and just something maybe to think about this week with the matchup that the Giants are in.
Yeah, I would have definitely been on that game. So last week's show is probably a better thing that I missed. That was 2 of the quarterbacks I liked were both sides of that game. I did like a couple others that had good games. Herbert was one of them, so I would have mentioned him, but for sure that game was a tough one. We'll get right into it, though. We've got the prize picks for this week. I've got a couple picked out. I'll start this week, JT. I feel this is like we talk about all the time, the other shows we've done together, but feel really good about the first one. The second one is definitely more risky. Another thing I like about prize picks, and it'll be in my second pick, is that you can utilize Sunday Night Football or any other of the slates where you don't have to worry about just the quote unquote main slate. You can bet what you like. And I do like the second pick. I know some think it's a little bit risky, but I'll talk about my first one that I love. And it's Robbie Anderson, a guy that you've been on in the past on this show for prize picks. The best part about him, and same as it did for you that week when you hit that prize pick, was that it can hit in one play. It's an over 43.5 receiving yards. I think, like I said, that's one play to a guy like Robbie Anderson. There's been plenty of talk this week about Darnold saying, look, I got a lot on the go here. No CMC, but I'm just trying to get straight with my guy, Robbie Anderson. They obviously played together for the Jets back when, so this is where they need to rekindle it, get it back together, and I think this is a good spot. We've got the high pace, high total, back and forth, Darnold trying to get back on track, as I mentioned. So I think this is a good spot. And I always love plays like this in props, where, as we mentioned, it could just be a 50-yard bomb to start the game, and it's no sweat the rest of the way. You don't have to worry about tacking on more points or needing more for your fantasy lineups. You've hit your prop. It's over. The money's yours. Go ahead with one of yours, and then I'll kick it back and take my more riskier play.
Yeah, so I'll start with the one that I think is perhaps safer than the second one, and that's Taylor Heinicke against the Atlanta Falcons, the over 242.5 passing yards. Heinicke looked really good in their first matchup against the New York Giants. Of course, the one common opponent for the Washington football team and the Falcons are each of those teams only win, the New York Giants. And they're going into Atlanta. They're going to play indoors in the Dome. And there's just nothing to fear on this Falcons defense. The reason why the Giants lost the game wasn't because of good defensive play on the Atlanta side. It was simply because of offensive ineptitude and injuries in that game. So Taylor Heinicke, he's got some weapons. We'll talk about them when we get to the individual matchups. But I think 242.5 is way too low, given the weapons at his disposal and the fact that this Falcons team is not going to put up much of a pass rush. They're not going to put up much of a defense at all. I think that's one of the safest numbers on the board this week.
Yeah, and that's funny because Taylor Heinicke and safe don't often go together very often, but I do think, like you said, the matchup makes it makes a lot of sense, and I think it could be a spot where he does have a big game. So I'm with you on that one. I do like that. I'm not sure what your second one is, so we'll get there in a minute, but I'll give you mine before. I said it's a little risky. I think there's a lot going on here. So Damian Harris plays Sunday night. We just saw James White go down. I know that they're not technically the same sort of back, so it doesn't really fully go with that situation. And also the snaps were down for Harris even after White went out. So is what it is. That's what may make it feel a little bit riskier, but over 39.5 is where I'm going with this one. I will take the chance. Remember, we know what this game is all about. It's Brady going back to New England. It's, all the interviews this week, the back and forth, the conversations about Belichick not meeting with them. It's taken over. The media is looking at this as obviously that's the number one storyline of this game. But I think it'll just be a product of volume here. I don't expect that New England will be able to keep up with them. That's going to be tough, but I expect Belichick to try and keep Brady off the field as long as he can. And I know there's Ramondre Stevenson and there's JJ Taylor for the sort of James White replacement type back. I've seen a lot of those in pickups and some of the waiver wire videos and stuff people talk about even here on Mayo Media Network. So subscribe, like, make sure you're checking out the other videos. But I would say that with that in mind, Harris can still stand out for me. They've got good matchups coming up. He hasn't been blocking as well. That's one of the notes out of everything people are talking about, the beat writers and whatnot. But it only takes one good game. And if if Belichick can count on him here to keep Brady off the field, do a little bit of his work, even if it's just a closer game than what some might have it for on paper, I definitely think he can hit over 39.5 yards. And I feel comfortable about it. Well, I know many others won't. So give me your thoughts on that, and then follow it up with your second prize pick of the week.
I think it's great. Obviously, James White going down is going to condense that backfield a little bit. And, people going to be off Damian Harris because of his last game, a really tough matchup against the New Orleans Saints. Of course, New Orleans got out to a lead and the Patriots had to throw to try and catch up, and they could not. Takes me right into my next play, which is going to be an under. It's my first under of the season on PrizePicks. I don't normally like going that route, but the number for rushing yards for Saquon Barkley is 60.5. I think he goes under that number. Like I said, the Saints have been very, very tough against the run. They even held down Christian McCaffrey a little bit. A lot of his damage came through the air. And I think that's what happens here. It's going to be really interesting to see because Slayton, of course, and Shepard went out with injuries. They're officially questionable. Kenny Golladay got, I don't know, one out of every 3 snaps, I think, in the game against the Falcons. So the Giants are 0-3. And this is one of those situations where early in the season, you're faced with almost a must-win game if you want to have any chance to compete for the postseason, which this team probably doesn't have much of a chance anyway. But I think people are going to say, well, they're going to have to focus on Saquon, but the New Orleans defense is going to do exactly that because they're going to know if they could take Saquon away, then these are all below league average weapons at Daniel Jones's disposal. So I think the passing opportunity might be there for Saquon in a game where the Giants should be playing catch up, but I don't think he's going to go over the 60.5 rushing yards.
Yeah, usually it's no fun picking an under because that's why we pick so many overs here. You like cheering for the points, cheering for the one play for Robbie Anderson and whatnot. But I really like that play. You mentioned the fact the Saints held down CMC. I think it was 72 yards on the ground by my numbers. But don't forget week 1, they also held down Aaron Jones. And that's a guy I'm going to talk about later, and he's had some big games since. So really good spot here. And 60.5 is a great number to get the under on with a guy like Barkley and just what the game flow might be in general, where maybe he picks up yards like McCaffrey picked up yards in that game. It was at home for Carolina through the air still. I think he had 6 for 65. But if you look at Barkley, that's going to be the spot where that doesn't matter. We're only talking about under 60.5 rushing yards. So let him pick the yards up through the air if that's what they have to do with Daniel Jones against the Saints. But I do like that call quite a bit. Anything else you want to talk about on PrizePicks here, or you want to move on?
No, we can move on. We've got a lot to cover here. 13 games, big slate, and even it looks like some calls on the Sunday and Monday night slates. I like it.
Yeah, this is the great slate. Like I said, it's a tougher one for me. And we're going to talk about DraftKings now because, like I said, when we've got more information, we find more things out. DraftKings also has the information. Therefore, you see some big price bumps. I'm talking about you, Cooper Kupp. But you got to make that decision. And that'll segue me right into the first spot I'm going to go here. So the way we do it is DraftKings picks, 2 per position, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end. We'll even talk a little bit about defense there at the bottom. This is definitely, to me, a tougher week for that. But quarterback, I'm going to start with Matt Stafford. I'm going to go back to it here. Here's the thing. I talk about it, but we've seen what Cooper Kupp has done. He's certainly helped Stafford, but Stafford's looked really good in his own right. He's just dropping it in a bucket. Everything looks good on his end. Quarterbacks versus Arizona have been absolutely going off. I don't expect that to go away. We know the pace gets brought up with Kyler out there and things like that. So I don't think this is going to go overlooked. I don't think this is sneaky, but I do like the fact that Kupp got the bit of a price bump. I think he was 6,800. Now he's up to 7,800, whatever it is, rightfully so, obviously getting a bump after the games that he's been having. But I like spots like this, JT, where it's almost, I call it like a roulette-esque theory, where people say, oh, it can't be read 6 times in a row. Kupp can't continue to do this, but then he just does. Remember a couple of years back, Adam Thielen, it was every single game and it didn't matter. And even he is doing kind of the same thing this year, not quite to Kupp's level, but having himself some good games. And this is just what I see where it definitely could continue. And I think his price bump and then the other factors of the stack may keep the total stack ownership a little bit in check. And then don't be scared to overstack with Stafford. I like going, if you can roll out Stafford, you can roll him with Kupp, Woods, and Higbee. I had a couple lineups last week with that were, close to getting there. Unfortunately, Robert Woods never wants to show up, but talk about him later too. So, there's where my theory or my theme is going for the week. The other guy I like is Sam Darnold. So goes above with my Robbie Anderson call, but we talked a little bit pre-show. I don't like Sam Darnold. I don't like that stack in general in the sense that it's more scary for a week like this, but the game I like, the flow, the total, the upside. And what I like most in situations like this is not about numbers and stats and all these things. All I care about on DraftKings is how I can stack it. And with having CMC out of the mix, while it may hurt the game and slow it down and change up the flow, I still know how to stack Darnold. We know who's going to be there with him. Some will talk later about Tremble. I'll bring that up. I know he's getting some conversation, but you've got DJ Moore, you've got Robbie Anderson, and you got Terrace Marshall Jr. That's who I'm going to stack him with. I know there's running backs there too. I'm just overlooking them and saying, look, Dallas can get them going. And plus, there's really nice run back options in the game on the Dallas side. We love using those guys. And if people are going to stack up with Dak, you've got Sam Darnold, who's $700 cheaper, but you can still use the Dallas options on the run back. So give me your thoughts on this at quarterback, and then give me your 2 picks for the week.
Stafford was actually one of the guys that I wrote down. I like that a lot. His price did not go up nearly to the extent that Cooper Kupp's did, just 7,000. And Arizona, another team that's been a bit of a challenge to run the ball on. Of course, Darnell Henderson missed the game last week, so we'll see if he is active this week, but certainly expect that Stafford is going to throw the ball just a whole bunch. That game in general is really interesting. I already talked about Taylor Heineke. I don't need to spend a lot more time on him. One guy I will talk about is Russell Wilson. The Seahawks, disappointing 1-2 going into San Francisco. San Francisco's defense giving up some big points and big games to quarterbacks as well early here in the season. And we saw that DK Metcalf got right. He didn't get right in a big way. It wasn't a true ceiling game for DK. But I think what you're seeing with Seattle, and they've talked about this openly, they're going to manage Chris Carson so that he stays healthy throughout the year. He was in and out of the game against Minnesota. Travis Homer came in. And to the extent that they're limited from taking the air out of the ball and forced to let Russ cook, so to speak, I think this is a nice spot at just 7.1K in the late game. If you're playing a late game quarterback, I think most people are going to go to Stafford. Most people maybe will look at Kyler Murray, whose price came down a little bit. But I think Russ is a little bit sneaky here in a game where, look, at this point, we have to have limited confidence in Seattle's defense and against a Kyle Shanahan-led offense where you just don't know who's going to get the points and who's going to get the ball, but you know that they can put up points and they can keep the ball. I think this is an interesting matchup.
Yeah, I really like that call. And one thing we don't talk about enough on here, and I think it's a good thing to bring up just strategy-wise, but late swap is a huge factor on DraftKings. It's something that you want to be utilizing. And I love the call you made for the afternoon quarterback situation where most will have Stafford. If you have a rough morning and your guys in the morning don't go off for you and you need to make some pivots, look to get off someone like Stafford and the chalk, and you could move over to that Seattle game. I think it definitely could be a battle. The total is still high. It's 52. Seattle's on the road. So I know they travel well. So that's one thing. The fans will still be there with them in San Francisco, but I do think it's a spot where they could have a game. So have them to start the slate, but also don't be afraid to pivot over to them with some late swap action if you've got some early lineups that don't do too well on the classic slate. I like that call. Another guy for me, a bonus one. I just have to bring it up because it'll segue into the running back position, but I probably won't do this. So maybe you should do this, but I may have to play some Goff, and you'll hear why when I talk about some of these other guys. But the first one at running back I'll start with goes right with that. DeAndre Swift, man. This guy, I don't know what else to say about him. He's getting the targets. He's got the floor. He's got the ceiling now built in. The floor built in. He's got the ceiling to go with it. The coaches say they trust him. They like him. They want to get him the ball more. He's looked good. He's shifty. And he's a guy kind of like what I talked about earlier, where you can just have someone carry you along. Hey, no disrespect to Drew Brees, but last season when he was going off before he retired, it was Kamara and Mike Thomas doing all the work. He was just getting them the ball. Big T likes to call him noodle arm back then, and that's kind of what it was. As long as he could just get the ball to the guys that could make plays, he looked good. And those numbers still rack up when he checks down to Swift, and then Swift takes it for 50 for a touchdown or something. So I really like DeAndre Swift here. I think he's still pretty cheap, and I'll take my shares with him for sure. The other guy I like is the one I mentioned earlier. So I know a lot of people are going to be on Najee Harris. Shout out to us. We were on him week 2, and I would have been on him last week. I know you liked him, but and if I was on the show, I was definitely on him. But we were early on him in week 2, stuck with him in week 3, where he went off and had his big game. It's pretty clear they want to utilize him, the way they are with the passing and the rushes with Deontay out. I'm not sure if that'll continue when we see Deontay eventually come back, but as of right now, I still like him. And I know a lot of people will talk about him, but I'm really liking the other side of that game. I like Aaron Jones. He's only 7.7K. It was just a couple weeks ago. We saw the 40-plus point upside in Showdown. I'll roll him out here again. He does have a Q tag, limited practices, so keep an eye on him. That could keep ownership down, though, if it gets to the end of the week and he's sort of that game time decision or a last-minute thing. So sub 8K at home. I like his chances. Also, going up against Pittsburgh, I know they got beat by the Bengals last week at home, and they're generally worse on the road. But it's tough to play. It's tough now to go into Green Bay and play there. Mixon played horrible last week and still ran for 90 on them. So I think this is a good spot for Aaron Jones. I think the upside's there. So I'll play him at 7.7K. What do you think of those guys or anything you have on them? And then what do you got at the running back position this week?
I definitely like the Jones call, especially in a game that you have to believe Green Bay is going to be able to run some clock there. So I think that's intriguing. And a couple of guys that I'm interested in, obviously the other side of the Detroit game, the Swift call. Now the Bears defense has been, limited sample size better at home. And I'm not sure what to make of that game. So I'm intrigued by the Swift call because obviously he does get the targets through the air as well. But in the Minnesota and Cleveland game, Nick Chubb at 7K, 22 carries last week and kind of a weird game against the Chicago Bears. But 7K is way too cheap for a guy of Nick Chubb's talent. He should be able to have his way with the Minnesota Vikings defense. And I think he makes for a pretty interesting play this week. Again, I'm sure the ownership is probably going to creep up because people are going to realize that is way, way too cheap for Nick Chubb. But I also think that the matchup is something that I can't ignore here in a game where I would guess with Jarvis Landry out and Baker Mayfield in his second game back that they're going to want to slow that game down a little bit because you have a very, very powerful offense in the Vikings on the other side. Other guy I like here is a guy who, again, I think people are not going to want to play. Bit of a disappointment so far to start the season. Very similar to last season, though, for Jonathan Taylor. Last week in Tennessee, Nyheim Hines was the guy who got the work and got into the end zone. The Colts were trailing during that game. Now they take on a Miami team. Of course, the game is in Miami, but it's a Miami team that gave up over 100 yards rushing to Peyton Barber last week. So I'm going to go with Jonathan Taylor at 6.3 and his talent. We've seen in games before where his price comes down and people are off of him because I don't know who they're going to play. Look, in these matchups, I believe that Jonathan Taylor is still going to be the guy. And you also have Carson Wentz limited and all sorts of questions there about his health. I think Jonathan Taylor is going to have an easy time this week with the Miami Dolphins.
This isn't just a JT bias, is it? JT likes JT?
No, it's a guy I almost never play. And I never play him for the reasons that I just talked about, why other people wouldn't play him, because you see Nyheim Hines, you don't know what the offense is doing. Now you've got Carson Wentz, who's injured, but I just can't ignore this matchup. This team is a defense that I thought was going to be decent has looked anything but.
Yeah, talent is there. Upside is always there with Jonathan Taylor. And also, I like the fact that it's a road game, low total, that sort of thing. Will oftentimes people will avoid just because of that. They'd rather get a piece of somebody in a higher scoring game or a higher octane offense or something like that where they can get after it. So I like the JT call quite a bit there. It does suit you well. So I'll go with that one with you for this week. Let's move on to wide receiver, though. Mine are going to be pretty straightforward. I talked a couple things already, but the Anderson one was the call I had for PrizePicks. I'm sticking with that, but like I said earlier, I'll add the other guys there. I think, with Darnold, it's Terrace Marshall, it's DJ Moore. I like those guys. I'm skipping ahead a little bit. I talked about him earlier, Tremble. I think he's $2,500 this week. A lot of people are talking about him. They shipped off, who was it? I can't remember who they moved off, but you just look at it in general. The stack will be made for most people with Tremble. I think anyone who plays Darnold will think about Tremble, get a cheap stack in, and then start loading up at these other positional pieces like the high-end running backs, for example, or getting a piece of the higher-priced wide receivers. I think you can just build these stacks a little bit different and just leave Tremble out of some of them where you are just getting DJ Moore for the short routes, yards after catch, potential end zone, red zone type looks, and then Anderson for the bomb or Marshall for the punt, where you can just use these guys and mix around them, and you'll naturally end up on either a little bit more balanced build or a punt at a different position than tight end, where you don't have to go that way. So I think there's lots of ways you can work the Carolina stacks. That's how I'm going with them, but I do like the wide receivers much more than the backup running backs or the cheap punt tight end that I think a lot of people will get to or will at least gain some steam by the end of the week. The other guy I talked earlier about, I know I said all those great things about Cooper Kupp and the roulette-esque theory of it can't happen again. It definitely can happen again, but I'm still leaning on Robert Woods. If you go look at the numbers, the talent, everything is there. The guy gets rush attempts. Like there's just so many opportunities, and it just hasn't happened yet, in my opinion. So I think he'll have a blow up game. We don't know when. I'll talk about this at tight end as well, and you know what that is. But I do think we could see one here. I think it's a prime spot. The Cup ownership will still be there, even with the price bump. But I do think you can get some interesting stacks going with Stafford, Woods, and Higbee. For example, Higbee still got you the points needed last week for that price, and he's still kind of cheap here too, getting ahead of ourselves. But I do think Woods can have a big game at some point here, and it's worth the risk considering his price did not go up at all. It's quite low, actually. So for me, Carolina receivers, named a few of them, and then Robert Woods. What are you thinking here at the wide receiver position, JT?
When you mentioned Woods, I talked about this on our Wishbone podcast that we recorded on Tuesday night at Run Pure Sports. It's up now everywhere you get your podcasts. And I said, look, at some point, a coach is going to start game planning to take away Cooper Kupp. I mean, you have to do that after, 5 touchdowns in 3 games? I mean, he almost had a 3rd touchdown rushing in that game against the Colts. And Woods, with the price down now all the way to 5.3, there's some concern because Deshaun Jackson is now in the mix. You've obviously got Van Jefferson still there. So definitely still some concern there for Woods and his target share. But I do think that once a coach takes away Cooper Kupp, and why won't it be Cliff Kingsbury? He's been pretty good at game planning for this team so far this season. I like that call. I like the Robbie Anderson call in particular because I've watched a couple of these Dallas Cowboys games and seen Trevon Diggs for the Cowboys absolutely shutting down number 1 wide receivers. So I have to think that he's going to be all over DJ Moore, which is going to give Robbie Anderson a few more targets. And then the back end of that secondary in Dallas is not all that great. So Sam Darnold has the big arm. He can get the ball downfield to Robbie Anderson. That's where he does much of his damage. So I like those 2 calls. A couple of guys that I'm on this week, I talked about Heineke. I talked about the Atlanta Falcons defense. Well, you can't play Taylor Heineke and not play Terry McLaurin, F1. I think this is just a perfect matchup for him, a perfect bounce back after a tough week last week against the Buffalo Bills. His price, just 6.9K on DraftKings. I think he is going to be a staple of most of my lineups this week. I liked your guys. I liked Anderson, and I liked Robert Woods. But one other player that I'll mention that I don't know if a lot of people are going to be on, we did see that DK Metcalf finally got right in that matchup against Minnesota. Some concern about the fact that Odell Beckham Jr. is really the only offensive weapon through the air that Baker Mayfield has, but I can't ignore the fact that with 1 game under his belt and his price point, just 5.8K on DraftKings, I think OBJ is going to be a low-owned tournament pivot that will allow you to fit some of the higher priced either running backs or receivers in. We didn't talk at all about Derrick Henry or Alvin Kamara, and I do think they're in play as well at the running back position. So you're going to need some of these guys, and I'll give one bonus too, because I don't think anyone is going to touch this New York Jets offense. And I'm not recommending Zach Wilson, but Corey Davis, 5.0 on DraftKings, had a big week 2 games ago. Then they go to Denver, always a tough place to play, especially with a rookie quarterback. And Corey Davis, maybe a little bit of resentment that Tennessee didn't stick with him, maybe thinking that he'd like to show them how valuable he would be to have right now because A.J. Brown is out. So Davis, 5.0, another mid-range wide receiver that takes a little bit of courage to play him because Zach Wilson has not been good since that week 1 game in Carolina. But I like it a little bit this week.
Love a couple of those calls, especially at the end there. The Corey Davis revenge spot, when, like you mentioned, we just didn't talk about them. We only talk about a couple of each position. If you guys want more of the plays that we're on, you definitely want to head on over to runpuresports.com. JT and I are now doing a Crack of Dawn show on Sunday, the Off the Chalk show. It's free. It's on YouTube. You can go to Run Pure Sports YouTube and check that one out. And get more information from what we're doing over there, and we'll go through everything. But I do like the Henry call anyway, and this fits well for a nice little mini game stack, right? We don't need to play Tannehill with Henry. It's nice to see he's getting a few targets now, which is awesome, but he does do most of his work on the ground, and typically him going for 80-yard touchdowns is just him mowing it down and going through everybody. So you could play him run it back the opposite side with just Corey Davis. Forget about Zach Wilson. It's hard to trust that Wilson can get it to him, like you said, but it's not that hard to trust. I mean, he's cheap enough that it's kind of priced in. So that's why I feel safe with that one. And then the OBJ one, I definitely like that little call there because you mentioned Chubb earlier, who I think, like you said, is a great call and will pick up steam as the week goes on. When people just realize this matchup, it's always nice to create some leverage that way. Maybe only make your lineups with one or the other and know that if it's not a Chubb week, you're not completely dead when you see OBJ dance in for a couple and you still feel pretty good about your overall builds or your overall player pool in the sense of that. So I really like those calls. I don't have too much else at the wide receiver, so I'll move it to tight end. It goes to the theme earlier. I mentioned it. Goff, really tough to trust, but TJ Hawkinson failed pretty much everybody last week after his first two great games going into Baltimore. But if you look at it, Goff didn't really throw the ball, right? They didn't have a lot of opportunity. I think he only threw the ball 30 times. I would expect that to bounce back some, have to throw the ball a little bit more here. Hawkinson's definitely got the talent. He's got the upside. We've seen it. Games 1 and 2, he had 20 and 27 DK points, give or take. And then you look last week against the Bears, Austin Hooper played them, got a couple grabs and a touchdown. So I think it's, a position they can get after them. I think it's a game where Hawkinson's just he's not seen or considered as one of the better tight ends. But it's just great for a guy like Goff. And in a game where I think he'll be throwing it more than what we just saw against Baltimore, I think you could have a bounce back spot here for TJ Hawkinson. So I do like him. The other one, I just saw a note before we hopped on the show. I was all over this, and I still will be, assuming everything's okay. And it fits nicely from earlier with your Russ Wilson call in that game. But George Kittle at just 5,900. I pretty much fell out of my seat when I saw that price. That's for a guy that's that involved in the offense. Now, like I said, the little tidbit that came out right before we hopped on did miss a second practice back-to-back. Keep an eye on it, but man, I would assume he plays. It could just be some rest or whatever. It's George Kittle. The guy you feel like he could play through a broken arm or something. So I definitely like him. Seattle can give it up to the tight end, and it's a good little spot in that afternoon where, like you mentioned, a lot of people are looking at some of these other game stacks. This could make for a sneaky spot. And one of my rules, JT, at tight end is the guys like Kelsey, Kittle, Waller, Hawkinson, any of the ones that I think are extremely talented and can actually get you 20 DK points. I'm always looking at them. If they're going overlooked or under 10% ownership, they're the ones I want to get up on because tight end, as we know in DraftKings, is a onesie position. You get tight end wrong and you don't have the perfect lineup, you could be broken for the slate and not have a way to get there. So if Kittle doesn't get ownership because of this missed practices and then he does play and he's sitting at, 5 to 10% ownership, I'll definitely want to get in on that. What are your thoughts here at the tight end position this week?
Yeah, Kittle's my top guy. I'm with you on him. Saw the price, same thing. Thinking people are going to be off him because of a slower start. A lot of questions around the San Francisco offense and the whole team, right? Who are they going to use? Who are they going to play? Everything is a secret out in San Francisco. But I don't think you're going to see a better price on George Kittle. And the matchup is quite good as well. We talked a little bit about how difficult it is to trust this Seattle Seahawks defense right now. So definitely on Kittle myself. A couple of other guys that I was looking at, I already talked about the Washington football team offense. Well, why not add Logan Thomas to the stack? He's another tight end that could get you 20 DK points, especially in this very soft matchup where we've seen tight ends have big games against them before. So Logan Thomas at 4.9. And then another matchup that I don't think people realize has been as good as it is, despite the fact that they shut down Hawkinson last week. I think that had a lot more to do with the fact that Hawkinson was really the only threat through the air for Detroit. If you take him away, obviously you saw the short passes to DeAndre Swift, but it was a much harder game plan for Detroit without Hawkinson. Noah Fant is still just 4.3, and Jerry Jeudy is still out. Interesting matchup here against the Ravens, but again, it is in Denver. It is going to be in thin air, and you figure that defense is going to get a little bit tired maybe earlier than they normally would. And I like the price on him, but definitely falls short behind Kittle and Thomas on my list.
Yeah, I like that call too. Baltimore, man, the D is just so bad right now. Almost lost it last week, if not for the Hall of Fame. I'll call him the Hall of Fame early on this, but Justin Tucker kick, man, that's crazy. The most yards, the record for kick for a game winner. You just got to love that. And as a Ravens fan, I absolutely did love that. So saved our ass after you had a guy like Marquise Brown drop 3 touchdowns. But yeah, I digress. Now, you thought I wasn't going to say it, but of course I'm going to say it. You mentioned Logan Thomas. There's another tight end in that game on the other side that, man, oh man, we got to make this thing work. We're on to week 4 now, JT. Your boy, Kyle Pitts, sitting at 5K still. Like, when's he going to explode, man? This has to be the spot, right?
He's got obvious. I mean, this is a great spot. It's a great spot for the Falcons. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is this a get right spot for the Washington football team? Because you're going up against an opposing quarterback that seems to have his feet glued to the turf. And it's just very difficult for them. Their play calling has been terrible. Cordero Patterson seems to be getting equal to maybe even more touches than Calvin Ridley in this offense. And Pitts, although he's on the field, he's not been targeted. And I don't even think it was something where you could say the Giants took him away from them, because they kept going to Ridley, despite the fact that he was covered. So I don't know what's stopping them from putting Kyle Pitts into better positions. One would think that Arthur Smith is going to do that at some point, but then watching these games, I'm losing a little bit of confidence in Arthur Smith, this person who is described as the architect of that high-powered Titans offense. Just hasn't gotten it done here. Now, to be fair, the offensive line has issues. They have a quarterback that is either in his last or next to last season in the league. And it's just maybe for me even easier to say I'd rather take a stab at that same price point, different position on Corey Davis with a rookie quarterback who can run and move around than I would on Kyle Pitts. But at some point, he's going to have that breakout game. I just don't know if we're going to be able to predict it. And to your point, maybe you mix in 10% Kyle Pitts just in case they figure out, hey, we've got to get this guy the ball.
Yeah, I heard everything you just said, but I'm going to pretend that I didn't and pretend that I heard play Heineke, play F1, play Logan Thomas, and play double tight end, because realistically, is Kyle Pitts a tight end or a wide receiver 1? We're still waiting to find out, but we're going to call him a wide receiver 1 on this show. I'm going to call him that on this show. And there's your stack of the week. You run those guys, throw in a little bit of Jonathan Taylor for our boy JT, and you got the JT special. So I love that. I don't think there's anything else for me to talk about at tight end, JT, but I do want to talk about defense a little. I know a lot of shows don't talk about this. We've come up with some good ones in the, this is the 3rd show I'm doing with you. You've done all 4. There's been some good defense calls for this, and it matters. You still have to play one. I know that we've talked about it in the past, and I personally do this in MME. I like to space it out. Put a cap of 20%, use whatever I get, get 7 to 8 in there just so I have a share of something. Try and pick 4 or 5 that I feel good about, but then let some randoms get in there. And this week for me, it's kind of the pay ups or the what you would expect. The Buffalo at home against Houston, I think they're like 17-point favorites. I don't care that they're expensive. That's why they are. And that's a lot of times where they'll come through. You get value with your Heineke stacks, and you can afford a defense like that. And then Green Bay, like I said, Pittsburgh, something worries me about them with not having their options like Deontay Johnson, just being out of it. Like, how do you lose at home to Cincinnati? There's just bad mojo all around for them. And they're already a team that we've talked in the past that we don't like going on the road. And now you got to go into Green Bay. Like I said, they just go so well with my Aaron Jones pick from earlier. Put Aaron Jones, put the Green Bay defense, and watch them tee off on guy. I'm just calling him Dusty Ben. Ben just looks so bad out there right now. It's just apparent. Like I said, it's just so obvious that he'll be gone sooner than later. So what are your thoughts on defense this week, JT?
I like those calls. And, Buffalo shut down a much better offense in Washington last week at home, and now they get Houston coming in. So I think that makes a ton of sense. I think there's plenty of value to be able to pay up at defense this week. A couple of the ones that I looked at are going to be lower price ones and maybe a little bit more risky. Definitely tournament options. Detroit is down to just 2.2. We saw that Justin Fields had a ton of trouble last week against the Cleveland Browns. And, I don't know. Detroit's defense, not great. But if you think about what Justin Fields has in his second game as a rookie, is this a spot where you can count on him? I think that, when I was looking at it earlier in the week, Allen Robinson, I was looking at, well, maybe this is an interesting lower owned play. His price came down a little bit. But then it's just so hard to trust a quarterback that looked as bad as Justin Field did. So Detroit at 2.2 if you wanted to pay down. And then another one, I like the Carolina offense here to a degree, but without Christian McCaffrey, if Sam Darnold has to throw the ball 45 or 55 times in a high-paced game, something that people don't do a lot is pay down for the opposing home defense. I mentioned how I thought Dallas's defense looked really good in the game this weekend, and they're just 2.6. So even if Carolina puts up 24, 27 points, we've seen this before where you get a pick six, you get a couple of sacks, and that defense could pay off at 2.6. So interesting tournament only for me. And then again, I do like the defenses that you talked about.
Yeah, that's not to go overlooked. I do think that's the way to go about it, especially for me. Like I like the Darnold side, talked a lot about them on this show. I got no problem taking 8-10% of the opposing D. Obviously, I'm not playing them against him. I know that's even worked in the past against Jameis Winston back in his Tampa Bay days. You could basically play the defense against him. He'd throw for 5 touchdowns. He'd also throw 3 or 4 picks. So it could work out in some cases, but I'm not advocating that. I just do agree with you that I think having some of the other side of a popular cheap stack, kind of like how I think Darnold could get when people, are on Anderson, Marshall, they've got Tremble in there. They're trying to make that work. Just getting the D on the other side does make a lot of sense. All right. Anything else that you want to talk about for this week from a DraftKings perspective, JT?
Interesting week. Hopefully everyone watching will visit runpuresports.com and check out our written content. I'll be writing a couple of articles, couple of games up tomorrow for Saturday morning. And then you mentioned right at the crack of dawn, as the sun is coming up, we'll be going live to talk about some of those lower owned plays on Sunday morning.
Yeah, I said it last week. I'll reuse the cheesy line, but I said when most are off the clock, we're talking off the chalk, and it's on Sunday mornings. I absolutely love that show. It's a great way to finalize your week, especially if you're setting rules in an optimizer or trying to even hand build and just make something a little bit unique for single entry or 3 max. I think it's a great way, and it's a free show. So come check us out. It's Run Pure Sports. It's on YouTube. Let the people know where they can find you, JT, and then I'll take us home.
At JT Hayes Jr. on the Twitter machine.
Yes, sir. And you can find me on Twitter at ToeTag and Tambo. Add me there. Hit me up if you guys have any questions. Other than that, thank you and good luck.